Nate didn't even hesitate when he said her name. He had this easy smile on his face, standing in the middle of his living room, glass raised like he'd been waiting for that moment all week. People were laughing, music low in the background, somebody already halfway through a joke about him finally being free. And when Jenica came up, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't emotional. It was light, casual, like she was something he had already packed away, and everybody just went along with it. At the exact same time, Jenica was sitting in her car across town, engine off, phone pressed against her ear so tight her knuckles had gone pale. The contract value is $50 million. The voice on the other end kept talking, but she wasn't really hearing it anymore, because she wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying either. She just sat there, quiet, like something inside her had finally settled instead of exploded. And if you saw both moments side by side, you'd probably ask the same thing I did when I first heard this story. How does one person celebrate losing you at the exact moment your life changes? And more importantly, what really happened between them that led to that night? Welcome to Mr. Graham's family. To every single one of you, thank you for the love and support. It means everything to me, and I promise to keep leveling up and bringing you the best content possible. If you're new here, don't be shy. Comment where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button to officially become part of the family. Jenica's mornings didn't start with alarms that played soft music or sunlight drifting perfectly through the blinds. Most days, it was the same sharp ringtone at 6:15 a.m., followed by her hand reaching out from under the covers, already knowing she couldn't hit snooze too many times. She lived just outside Richmond, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much changed. Same neighbors, same cracked sidewalks, same mailboxes that leaned just a little too far to the left. It wasn't the kind of place people bragged about, but it was stable, and that mattered to her more than anything. By 7, she was usually in the kitchen, standing barefoot on cool tile, packing her lunch, leftovers if she had them, something quick if she didn't. Coffee brewing in the background, the sound steady, familiar. She liked that kind of consistency. It gave her something to rely on before the day started asking things from her. Her job wasn't glamorous. Project coordinator at a logistics company that most people had never heard of, but she was good at it. The kind of good that didn't get celebrated out loud, but got noticed in quiet ways. Deadlines met, problems solved before they became disasters. Co-workers who came to her instead of their supervisors when things got confusing. Jenica, can you look at this real quick? Her co-worker Marcus would say, leaning over her desk, already half expecting she'd have the answer. She usually did, not because she knew everything, but because she paid attention. That was who she had always been. Sundays were non-negotiable. No matter how busy the week got, Jenica showed up to her aunt's house like clockwork. The same warm kitchen, the same voices overlapping, the same mix of laughter and low-level arguing that never really meant anything serious. "Girl, you late," her aunt would call out the second Jenica stepped through the door, even if she was only 5 minutes behind. "I'm here, ain't I?" Jenica would reply, already slipping off her shoes and heading toward the kitchen. Her younger cousins would drift in and out, asking her about school, about jobs, about life in that way younger people do when they're trying to figure out their own direction without saying it directly. "You ever think about leaving that job?" One of them asked her once, sitting on the edge of the couch. Jenica shrugged lightly. "Sometimes. But I like knowing what my week looks like. Not everything gotta be a risk." Her aunt overheard that and nodded from across the room. "Stability ain't boring," she said. "It's peace." People learn that too late. Jenica didn't say anything, but she carried that with her, because for her, peace wasn't loud. It wasn't attention-grabbing. It was quiet, predictable, earned. If you asked people in her life to describe her, they'd probably all say something similar. Dependable. That was the word that followed her everywhere. She showed up. She listened. She handled things without needing recognition for it. But what people didn't always see was how much she carried internally. The pressure to be the one who didn't fall apart, the one who figured things out, the one who stayed steady, even when things around her shifted. She didn't talk about that part much, not because she didn't feel it, but because she didn't see the point in making it everyone else's burden. In the evenings, her routine slowed down again. She'd sit on her couch, sometimes with the TV on low, sometimes in silence, scrolling through her phone or just letting her thoughts settle. She wasn't chasing anything flashy. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just wanted a life that made sense, a life where the people she loved were okay, a life where she didn't have to constantly prove her worth. And at the center of that life, for a long time, was Nate. Back then, when things were simpler, when nothing about their life looked impressive from the outside, Jenica believed she had chosen right, not because Nate had everything together, but because she thought he was someone who would grow, and remember who stood next to him while he did. At that point, she didn't realize something important. Some people grow, and some people change in ways you don't recognize until it's too late. Jenica leaned back against her couch one night, staring at the ceiling, her phone resting loosely in her hand. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and for her, that had always been enough. At least, it used to be. Before the bigger house, before the suits that actually fit right, before people started returning Nate's calls faster than he expected, there was a version of their life that most people never saw: a smaller apartment, thin walls, a couch they bought secondhand from someone who was moving out in a hurry. You could sit in the middle of it and feel the springs shift if you leaned too far to one side. That was where most of their real conversations happened. Late at night, after long days that didn't always feel productive, Nate would sit forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. "I just feel like I'm missing something," he said once, running a hand over his face. "Like everybody else got the playbook, and I'm out here guessing." Jenica sat cross-legged beside him, her hair wrapped up, one of his old t-shirts hanging loose on her frame. "You're not guessing," she said. "You're figuring it out. That's the same thing." "It's not," she replied, nudging his arm lightly. "Guessing is random. You're trying." "That's different." He let out a small breath, not quite a laugh. "You really believe that? I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't." And that was the thing about Jenica. She didn't say things just to say them. When she believed in you, you could feel it. Money was tight more often than they liked to admit. They had a system, unspoken but understood. Bills came first, always. Rent, utilities, groceries, everything else got whatever was left. There were nights when Jenica would stand in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets, figuring out how to stretch what they had into something that felt like a meal instead of a reminder. "You want the last of this?" she asked one evening, holding up a container of leftover pasta. Nate shook his head. "You take it. I ate earlier." She looked at him for a second longer than usual. "You sure?" "Yeah," he said, not meeting her eyes. She didn't push, but later that night, when she got up for water, she saw him in the kitchen, quietly eating a peanut butter sandwich like he didn't want her to notice. She didn't say anything the next morning, just made a little more breakfast than usual. They didn't have much, but they found ways to make small things feel like something. Takeout nights were a big deal, not because of the food, but because it meant they had a little breathing room. "You want to do Chinese or wings?" Nate asked one Friday, scrolling through his phone. Jenica smiled. "You only ask me that when you already decided." He grinned. "Okay, yeah. Wings. Of course." They sat on the couch, TV on, cartons open between them, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. Those moments weren't flashy, but they were real. There were also the hard conversations, the ones that didn't get solved in a single night. "I'm tired of starting over," Nate admitted once, his voice quieter than usual. "Every time something doesn't work, it's like I'm back at zero." Jenica leaned her head against the back of the couch, thinking. "You're not starting over," she said after a moment. "You're building on everything that didn't work yet." He glanced at her. "That sounds good, but it don't feel like that." "I know," she said, "but feelings ain't always facts." He sat with that, and for a while, that was enough. What most people didn't see was how much Jenica carried during those years. Not just financially, but emotionally. She was the steady one, the one who didn't panic when things got uncertain, the one who reminded Nate of who he said he wanted to be, especially on the days he doubted himself. "You're gonna get there," she told him more times than she could count. Not in a loud, dramatic way, just consistently. And that consistency mattered. There were moments, small ones, where Nate would look at her like he understood that, like he knew exactly what she was doing for him. "Don't know what I'd do without you," he said once, pulling her into a quick hug before heading out the door. She smiled into his shoulder. "You won't have to find out." At the time, she meant it. And so did he. Looking back, that version of their relationship wasn't perfect. They argued. They got frustrated. They had moments where things felt uncertain. But there was something underneath all of it that held. Respect, appreciation, partnership. They were building something together, even if it was slow, even if it didn't look impressive yet. And Jenica never once made Nate feel like he was behind. She made him feel like he was on his way. That's why, when things finally started to shift for him, she didn't question it. She celebrated it. Because in her mind, this was the moment all those late nights, all those quiet sacrifices, all that belief, finally paid off. She just didn't realize yet that not everyone remembers who stood beside them once they arrive. The first real change didn't come with an argument. It came with a pause, one of those small, almost invisible moments that wouldn't mean anything to anyone else. But Jenica felt it immediately. It was a Thursday evening. Nate had just gotten back from a meeting, still dressed like he had somewhere else to be. His energy was different, not tired, not stressed, just sharper. "Hey," she said from the kitchen, glancing over her shoulder. "You eat yet?" "Yeah," he replied quickly, dropping his keys on the counter. Had something after the meeting. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way he didn't ask her the same question back. Jenica stood there for a second, hand resting on the stove, waiting for the rhythm they always had to fall into place. It didn't. "So, how'd it go?" she asked instead. Nate loosened his tie, exhaling like the day had been heavier than it probably was. "It was good," he said. "Actually, really good." She smiled, turning fully toward him now. "Yeah? Yeah." He nodded, a small grin forming. "I think this one might be different." There it was, that spark she recognized, the same one he used to get when something finally started lining up. Jenica felt it too. "That's what I'm talking about," she said, walking over and wrapping her arms around him. "See? I told you." He hugged her back, but it was brief, just a second too short. Then he pulled away. "I gotta make a couple calls," he added, already reaching for his phone. She stepped back slowly, her smile still there, but softer now. "Okay." At first, she told herself it was just momentum. When things start working, people get busy. That's normal. That's what she had been hoping for. But then, the little things started stacking. Conversations got shorter. Plans got postponed. And when he was home, he wasn't really there. One night, they sat at the table across from each other, both with plates in front of them. Nate scrolled through his phone between bites. Jenica watched him for a moment before speaking. "You remember we said we were going to go see my aunt this Sunday?" He didn't look up right away. I got something that day." She nodded slowly. "You already committed to it?" "Yeah, it's important." She picked at her food, thinking, "You didn't mention it before." "I just found out," he said, still not fully meeting her eyes. Another pause. "Okay," she said quietly. That word again. Okay. It started showing up more often. The first time Nate said something that sat wrong with her, it came out like a joke. At least, that's how he delivered it. They were getting ready to leave for one of his work events. Jenica stood in the bedroom, adjusting her earrings, trying to decide if what she had on felt appropriate. "You ready?" Nate called from the doorway. "Almost," she said, glancing at herself in the mirror one more time. "This look all right?" He looked her over, quick, assessing. "It's fine," he said. Then, after a second, he added, "Just don't be too quiet tonight. You gotta speak up around these people." Jenica turned toward him slightly. "I don't usually have a problem talking," she said. "I know," he replied, shrugging. "I'm just saying, it's different now. You gotta match the energy." The words weren't loud, but they lingered. Match the energy. She gave a small nod. "All right," but something about it didn't sit right. Not enough to argue, just enough to notice. At the event, she saw what he meant. The room was louder, faster. Conversations moved like everyone was trying to prove something. Nate fit into it easily, laughing a little louder, talking a little faster, interrupting in ways he never used to. Jenica stayed close at first, listening, observing, trying to find her place in a room that didn't feel built for her. At one point, a woman standing next to Nate leaned in and said something that made him laugh. "Man, you've come a long way," she said. "You upgraded everything." Jenica caught that. The word, upgraded. Nate didn't correct her. He just smiled. On the drive home, the silence felt different. Not heavy. Just unfamiliar. "You were kinda quiet tonight," Nate said, eyes still on the road. Jenica looked out the window for a moment before answering. "I was just listening." He nodded. "Yeah, but you gotta engage more. People notice that." She turned back toward him. "I was engaging." "I'm just saying," he replied. "A little sharper now. You can't sit back like that in those spaces." Jenica studied him for a second, then nodded again. Okay, there it was again. But this time, it didn't feel like agreement. It felt like distance. Over the next few weeks, moments like that kept happening. Nothing explosive. Nothing that could easily be pointed to and labeled as a problem. Just a shift in tone, a slight edge in his voice, a little less patience, a little more correction. "You should have handled that differently. You gotta think ahead more. That's not how things work at this level." At this level, that phrase started showing up too, and every time it did, it felt like he was placing himself somewhere she wasn't. One night, Jenica sat alone on the couch after Nate had gone to bed early. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching it. Her mind kept replaying small moments. His tone, his words, the way he looked at her sometimes now, not with frustration, but with something harder to define, like he was evaluating her, measuring. She exhaled slowly, leaning her head back. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe this was just what growth looked like. People changed. Situations changed. That didn't automatically mean something was wrong, right? She sat with that question longer than she expected. When she finally got up to turn off the lights, she paused in the doorway of their bedroom. Nate was already asleep, turned slightly to one side, his phone still on the nightstand beside him. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at him, at them, at what this had been, and what it was starting to feel like. She didn't say anything, didn't wake him up, didn't ask the questions sitting heavy in her chest. Instead, she walked in quietly, slid into bed, and faced the opposite direction, telling herself something she wasn't fully sure she believed. It's just a phase. It'll pass. But deep down, she had already felt it. Something had shifted, and instead of confronting it, she chose to love him through it, even if she didn't yet understand what it would cost her. The move happened faster than Jenica expected. One minute, they were still in that small apartment where everything had a place because it had to. The next, Nate was walking her through a 2-story house in a quiet Virginia suburb, keys in his hand like he had been waiting his whole life for that moment. "What you think?" he asked, turning to look at her, a kind of excitement in his eyes she hadn't seen in a while. Jenica stepped into the living room slowly, taking it in. The ceilings were higher, the windows bigger, the space quieter. "It's nice," she said. And she meant it. Nice didn't fully capture it, but she wasn't someone who used big words for things just because they looked impressive. Nate laughed lightly. "Nice?" She smiled a little. "Okay, it's more than nice." He nodded, satisfied. "Yeah," he said. "It's a step up. A step up." Jenica repeated that phrase in her head without meaning to, because for her, it didn't feel like a step up. It felt like a step into something unfamiliar. The first few weeks in the new house felt more like adjusting than settling. There was more space than they needed, rooms that didn't have a purpose yet, furniture that looked better than it felt. Jenica found herself moving through it differently, careful, almost like she didn't want to disturb something. Even the silence felt different. In the apartment, there had always been noise, neighbors, traffic, the hum of life happening close by. Here, it was still, too still, sometimes. One evening, she stood in the kitchen, looking around at the polished countertops, the clean lines, everything in its place. Nate walked in behind her, phone in hand, mid-conversation. Yeah, we can host here," he said. "It's perfect for that." He ended the call and glanced at her. "We're having people over Friday," he added casually. Jenica blinked. "Friday?" "Yeah, just a few people." She nodded slowly. "Okay. What kind of few people?" He shrugged. "You'll see. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Friday came, and the house didn't feel like hers anymore. Voices filled every room. People she didn't know walked through spaces she hadn't even gotten used to yet. Laughter came easy, but it didn't feel warm. Nate moved through the crowd like he belonged there, confident, relaxed, in control. Jenica stayed closer to the edges at first, holding a glass she hadn't really touched, listening more than she spoke. "Hey," Nate said at one point, appearing beside her. "Come meet some people." She followed him, adjusting her expression into something polite, open. "This is Jenica," Nate said, placing a light hand on her back. "My wife." The introduction was simple, but something about it felt shortened, like there was more he could have said, or maybe used to say. The conversations moved fast. Business, deals, opportunities. People talked in ways that felt like they were always trying to stay ahead of each other. Jenica listened, picking up pieces where she could. "So what do you do?" someone asked her, smiling in a way that felt more curious than interested. "I work in logistics," she said. "Project coordination." The smile stayed, but it shifted slightly. "Oh, okay," the woman replied, nodding. "That's stable." "Stable?" Jenica gave a small smile back. "Yeah, it is." She didn't miss the tone, but she didn't respond to it either. Later that night, after everyone left, the house fell quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt unfamiliar. Nate walked through the living room, picking up a few empty glasses, still riding the energy of the night. "That went well," he said. Jenica leaned against the counter, arms loosely folded. "It was a lot," she replied. He glanced at her. "That's how it is now." Now, another word that lingered. Over the next few weeks, that world became more regular. More dinners, more events, more people. And with each one, Jenica felt it more clearly. She wasn't stepping into a shared life. She was stepping into his. Nate started paying more attention to things he never used to care about. What he wore, where they went, who they were seen with. And slowly, without saying it directly, that attention started turning toward her too. "You wearing that?" he asked one evening, leaning against the bedroom doorframe. Jenica looked down at her outfit, simple, clean, something she felt comfortable in. "Yeah," she said. "Why?" He hesitated for a second, like he was choosing his words carefully. "It's fine," he said. "Just, these events are a little different." She held his gaze. "Different? How?" He shrugged. "Just more put together, I guess." Jenica nodded slowly. "All right." She turned back to the mirror, adjusting her sleeves slightly, not because she thought she needed to, but because she felt the shift in the air. That night, standing in a room full of people who all seemed to understand each other without trying, Jenica realized something she hadn't said out loud yet. She didn't feel like she was growing with Nate. She felt like she was being measured against something she never agreed to. On the drive home, Nate talked about connections, opportunities, next steps. Jenica listened, but her mind was somewhere else. She looked out the window, watching the streetlights pass in a steady rhythm, and for the first time, she had a thought she couldn't ignore. This life wasn't built for her, and she wasn't sure Nate was trying to make space for her in it anymore. She didn't say that out loud, not yet, but the feeling stayed, quiet, steady, and growing. The first time Nate joked about her, Jenica almost laughed too. It happened at one of those dinners he had started going to more often, the kind where everyone sat a little straighter, talked a little louder, and seemed to measure each other without saying it out loud. They were at a restaurant just outside the city, low lighting, polished tables, the kind of place where the menu didn't have prices you could easily see. Jenica sat beside Nate, listening, as the conversation moved from contracts to travel to things she didn't pretend to fully understand. She didn't mind that. She had never needed to be the loudest voice in the room. But then, someone asked Nate a simple question. "So, how long you two been together?" Nate leaned back in his chair, arm resting casually behind her. "About 8 years," he said. "She's been holding it down since before any of this." There was a brief moment, just a second, where Jenica felt something warm in that statement. But then he added, with a small chuckle, "Jenica keeps me grounded. She's still living in 2015. The table laughed, not loudly, not harshly, but enough. Jenica smiled, the kind of smile you give when you don't want to make something awkward. But inside, she paused, because She didn't fully understand what he meant. Or maybe she did, and didn't want to. On the drive home, she brought it up carefully. What you meant earlier about me living in 2015. Nate glanced at her briefly before looking back at the road. It was a joke, he said. I know, she replied. I just didn't get it. He sighed, like the explanation itself was unnecessary. I'm just saying, you don't really keep up with things, trends, conversations. It's not a big deal. Jenica looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said, but something about the way he said it didn't feel light. It felt dismissive. After that, the jokes didn't stop. They just became easier for him to say. At another gathering, someone asked about their daily routines. Nate laughed. Man, Jenica's still on that 9 to 5 schedule, like the world ain't changed. Again, people chuckled. Jenica kept her expression calm. It works for me, she said simply. Yeah, Nate added quickly, smiling. She likes structure. Likes structure. He said it like it was a limitation instead of a strength. The more it happened, the more Jenica started noticing a pattern. It wasn't just what Nate said. It was what he didn't say. He didn't correct people when they made assumptions about her. Didn't add context. Didn't remind anyone who she had been to him before all of this. He just let the room shape its own version of her. And slowly, that version started sticking. His family wasn't much different. At a gathering one afternoon, Jenica found herself in the kitchen with Nate's sister. The conversation started normal enough. Small talk, light questions. But then his sister leaned against the counter, studying her in a way that felt more intentional than casual. You ever think about doing something bigger? She asked. Jenica raised an eyebrow slightly. Bigger how? His sister shrugged. I don't know. Something that matches where Nate is now. There it was again. That idea. That she needed to match him. I'm doing something, Jenica replied, her tone steady. I didn't say you weren't, his sister said quickly, though her expression didn't fully agree. I'm just saying, things change. You don't want to get left behind. Jenica held her gaze. I'm not trying to compete with my husband, she said. His sister smiled slightly. Not compete, she said. Just keep up. Later that day, Jenica brought it up to Nate. Your sister said something earlier, she began, sitting on the edge of the couch. Nate didn't look up from his phone. What? She asked if I ever thought about doing something that matches where you are now. He shrugged lightly. I mean, that's not crazy. Jenica blinked. You agree with that? I'm just saying, he replied, finally glancing at her. Things are different now. People notice stuff like that. Jenica sat back slightly. People notice what? He hesitated, then said it anyway. Imbalance. The word landed heavier than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as heavy as he intended. That night, Jenica lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, letting the day replay in her mind. The jokes, the conversations, the way Nate had said that word, imbalance. She tried to make sense of it, tried to see it from his perspective. Maybe he wasn't trying to hurt her. Maybe this was just how things worked at that level. Maybe she needed to adjust. That's what she told herself, because the alternative, that he was starting to see her differently, felt harder to accept. Over time, the laughter around those jokes started to feel louder, even when it wasn't, because now she heard the meaning behind them, and what hurt the most wasn't that other people laughed. It was that Nate gave them something to laugh at. One evening, as they got ready for yet another dinner, Jenica stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her earrings again. She paused, looking at her reflection a little longer than usual. Then she turned slightly toward Nate. Do you think I embarrass you? The question hung in the air. Nate froze for just a second, then shook his head quickly. No, he said. Why would you even ask that? She held his gaze. Because of the way you talk about me sometimes. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You're taking it too seriously, he said. It's just jokes. Jenica nodded slowly. Okay, there it was again. But this time, it didn't feel like agreement at all. It felt like something inside her, stepping back, and Nate didn't notice, or maybe he did, and didn't think it mattered, because to him, it was still light, still harmless, still nothing worth addressing. But to Jenica, Those small moments were adding up, and she was starting to understand something she hadn't wanted to admit before. Disrespect doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes wrapped in laughter, and the people who laugh the hardest aren't always the ones hurting the most. The shift didn't fully reveal itself in public. Public was still controlled, measured, filtered just enough to pass as normal. It showed itself at home, in the quiet, in the moments where there was no one else to perform for. It started with tone, not yelling, not anything you could point to and say, this is where it broke. Just sharper edges, shorter patience, less room for her to exist without being corrected. One evening, Jenica stood in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while stirring something on the stove. It wasn't anything complicated, just dinner after a long day. Nate walked in, dropped his keys on the counter, and glanced toward the pot. What is that? Chicken and rice, she said. You said you didn't want anything heavy tonight. He walked closer, lifting the lid slightly, then set it back down. You seasoned it. Jenica blinked, a little caught off guard. Yeah, of course. He shrugged, not really looking at her. I'm just asking. Last time, it was kinda bland. The words weren't loud, but they weren't necessary either. Jenica let out a small breath. You ate all of it last time. That don't mean it was good, he replied, already reaching for a bottle of water. Silence settled between them, not heavy, just uncomfortable. Later that night, they sat in the living room. Nate had his laptop open, going through something work-related. Jenica sat on the other end of the couch, half watching TV, half waiting for a moment that felt like connection. You busy all night? She asked after a while. Probably, he said, without looking up. She nodded. Okay. A few minutes passed. Then, we haven't really talked all week, she added, her voice calm, but careful. Nate exhaled, leaning back slightly. Jenica, I've been working. I know, she said. I'm just saying, I'm building something right now, he interrupted. This isn't the time to be distracted. She sat still for a second. Talking to your wife is a distraction? He rubbed his face, clearly irritated now. That's not what I said. It kinda is. Another pause. Then he shook his head. You're twisting it. Jenica leaned back into the couch, her expression tightening just slightly. I'm not twisting anything, she said. I just asked a question. That became another pattern. Conversations that started small, ended somewhere colder than they needed to. The kitchen argument happened on a night that wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just another evening. But those were always the ones that carried the most weight. Jenica had forgotten to confirm a reservation. It wasn't intentional. Her day had been full. Calls, emails, a last-minute issue at work that ran later than expected. By the time she remembered, it was already too late. We can just go somewhere else, she said, setting her phone down. It's not a big deal. Nate stood across from her, jaw tight. It is a big deal, he said. She frowned slightly. It's just dinner, Nate. It wasn't just dinner, he snapped. I told you this was important. I know, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I just forgot to confirm it. We can still... You had one thing to handle, Jenica, he cut in. One. The words landed harder this time, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. She straightened slightly. I've been working all day too, she replied. Things happen. He laughed. Short, cold. That's the problem. She stared at him. What is? You don't think ahead, he said, his voice lower now but sharper. You don't operate at the level I do. The room went quiet, completely quiet. Jenica felt something shift inside her, not loudly, not dramatically, just something settling into place. You're acting like I'm beneath you, she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Nate didn't respond right away, and in that silence, she got her answer. He didn't deny it. He didn't correct it. He didn't even soften it. He just looked at her like the conversation had already gone on too long. Jenica swallowed slowly. You hear how you sound right now? She asked. Nate shook his head, already turning away slightly. I don't have time for this, he said. I've got bigger things to worry about than reservations. Bigger things. There it was again. That separation, that line he kept drawing between them. She stood there in the kitchen, watching him walk out of the room like nothing had just happened, like he hadn't just reduced her to something smaller, something less. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react the way she thought she would, because the truth was, this wasn't shocking anymore. It was just clearer. Later that night, she sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting in her lap, her thoughts quieter than they had ever been, not because she didn't have anything to feel, but because she finally understood what she was feeling. This wasn't stress. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't something that would fix itself if she just gave it time. This was who he was becoming. And more importantly, this was who he was choosing to be with her. Nate walked into the room a while later, already focused on something on his phone. He didn't bring up the argument, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge it. He just moved around, like the moment had already passed. Jenica watched him for a second, then looked away, because something in her had shifted too. Not completely, not enough to leave, but enough to see. And once you see something clearly, you can't go back to pretending you don't. That night, lying in bed beside him, Jenica stared into the dark, her mind steady in a way it hadn't been before. She wasn't confused anymore. She wasn't overthinking. She wasn't making excuses. She was recognizing something real. The way he spoke to her, the way he saw her, the way he was slowly pulling himself above her, instead of standing beside her. And in that quiet realization, something inside her stopped holding on as tightly as it used to. Jenica understood something she hadn't allowed herself to fully accept until now. This wasn't just pressure. This wasn't just success changing his schedule. This was success changing his character. And for the first time, she didn't try to explain it away. By the time things started falling apart for real, Nate had already told a version of the story where it made sense, just not the real one. It didn't happen in one big announcement. It happened in conversations, small ones at first, then more confident ones, then the kind where he didn't even realize he was repeating the same narrative. "I built myself up," he said one night, sitting across from a group of people after a dinner had thinned out into smaller circles. "At some point, you gotta be honest about who's growing with you and who's not." Someone nodded immediately. "That's real," they said. Nate leaned back slightly, comfortable. "I'm not saying she's a bad person," he added. "We just, not on the same level anymore. Not on the same level." He said it like it was objective, like it didn't come with history. The more he said it, the easier it became. And the easier it became, the more people agreed. "You can't drag people with you," someone told him over drinks one night. "That's how people get stuck." Nate nodded like he had been thinking the same thing. Exactly. At a family gathering, it was even more direct. His father sat across from him, glass in hand, listening as Nate explained things in that calm, measured tone he had started using more often. "I just feel like I've outgrown the situation," Nate said. "It's not healthy to stay in something that's not aligned anymore." His father didn't hesitate. "Then don't stay," he said simply. Nate looked at him. "You think that's fair?" His father shrugged. "You work to get where you are," he said. "You don't owe anybody your success." The words landed clean. No hesitation, no pushback. That was all Nate needed. Not permission, just confirmation. The more those conversations happened, the more his perspective hardened. It stopped feeling like a decision. It started feeling like a conclusion. At another dinner, someone asked casually, "So what's next for you?" Nate smiled slightly. "Honestly," he said, "probably a reset." "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "Just clearing out anything that doesn't fit where I'm going." Someone raised their glass. "To growth." Nate lifted his in return. "To growth." And in those moments, Jenica wasn't a person anymore. She was an idea, a phase, something he had already mentally moved past. What he didn't say in those rooms was who had been there before the growth, who had held things together when there was nothing to celebrate, who had made space for him when he didn't even know what he was building. That part didn't fit the new version of the story, so he left it out. And the more he left it out, the easier it became to believe it didn't matter. By the time he started seriously thinking about divorce, he wasn't questioning himself anymore. He wasn't conflicted. He wasn't unsure, because in his mind, he wasn't leaving something good. He was moving forward, and everyone around him made sure that belief stayed intact. What Nate didn't realize was that rewriting the story didn't change what actually happened. It just changed how comfortable he felt walking away from it. And comfort can be dangerous when it's built on half-truths, because eventually, reality shows up, and it doesn't care what version you told everyone else. Jenica didn't confront Nate after those conversations started happening, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had already tried, in smaller ways, to reach him, and each time, it led nowhere. So instead of pushing harder, she got quieter. It wasn't obvious at first. From the outside, nothing dramatic changed. She still went to work, still handled what needed to be handled, still showed up where she was expected. But something about her presence shifted. She stopped explaining herself. Before, if Nate misunderstood something, she would take the time to clarify. If he made a comment that felt off, she would gently question it. If something didn't sit right, she would try to talk it through. Now, she let things land and let them stay there. "You good?" Nate asked one evening, glancing at her briefly from across the room. "Yeah," she said, and that was it. No follow-up, no unpacking, no effort to bridge the gap he had been widening for months. At first, Nate didn't notice, or maybe he noticed and interpreted it differently. Less resistance, less questioning, less friction. To him, it probably felt easier. But what he didn't understand was that Jenica wasn't becoming more comfortable. She was becoming more distant. She started spending more time in her own head, not overthinking, not spiraling, just observing, watching how things unfolded without trying to control them. One night, after finishing dinner alone because Nate had texted that he'd be late again, Jenica sat at the table with her laptop open. The house was quiet, too quiet, but this time, it didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt usable. She pulled up a document she had been working on in pieces for months, something she had never talked about out loud, not to Nate, not to anyone. A logistics proposal, detailed, structured, thought out, in the same steady way she approached everything else in her life. She had started it casually at first, just an idea, something to explore. But over time, it became more than that. It became something she could build, something that belonged to her. She leaned forward slightly, rereading what she had written, adjusting a sentence, reworking a section, adding details, the kind of work that didn't look exciting, but required focus, patience, and clarity. All things she had always been good at. For a moment, she paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, because she realized something. Months ago, she would have shared this with Nate, would have told him about the idea, asked what he thought, maybe even gotten excited together. Now, she didn't feel the need to, not because she didn't value his opinion, but because she didn't trust what his reaction would be. Would he take it seriously? Would he dismiss it? Would he turn it into another example of how she wasn't thinking big enough? She didn't want to find out, so she kept it to herself, and in doing that, something shifted again. Quietly, but significantly, she wasn't shrinking. She wasn't giving up. She was redirecting. Instead of trying to fix what was breaking between them, she started building something separate from it. Days turned into weeks, and that quiet focus became part of her routine. Work during the day, her own work at night, sometimes just an hour, sometimes longer. No announcements, no conversations about it, no need for validation, just progress. Meanwhile, the space between her and Nate continued to widen, not through arguments, but through absence. They stopped checking in with each other the way they used to, stopped sharing small details about their day, stopped noticing the little things that used to matter. One evening, Nate walked in late again, setting his keys down with the same distracted energy he carried most nights now. "You still up?" he asked. Jenica looked up from her laptop briefly. "Yeah," he nodded, heading toward the kitchen. "What you working on?" he asked casually. Jenica glanced at the screen, then back at him. "Just something for work," she said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. He didn't ask anything else, didn't come closer, didn't show interest. And for the first time, that didn't disappoint her, because she had already adjusted her expectations. Later that night, as she closed her laptop and sat in the quiet, Jenica felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Not relief, not happiness, but clarity. She couldn't control who Nate was becoming. She couldn't force him to see her differently. She couldn't make him remember what they used to be, but she could decide what she did with herself. And instead of fighting to stay in a space where she felt less and less seen, she started creating one where she didn't have to ask to be recognized at all. That was the part Nate never noticed. Not the arguments they didn't have, not the explanations she stopped giving, not the effort she quietly redirected somewhere else, because from his perspective, nothing had changed enough to matter, but from hers, everything had. And the most important part, she didn't feel the need to explain it anymore. By the time Nate finally said the word out loud, it didn't come with emotion. It came with timing. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing special about it. Jenica had just gotten home, her bag still resting on the chair near the door, her shoes barely off before she headed into the kitchen out of habit. Nate was already there, not on his phone, not distracted, just waiting. That alone felt unusual. "Hey," she said, pausing when she noticed the stillness in the room. "Hey," he replied. There was a short silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, it felt prepared. "We need to talk," Nate said. Jenica leaned slightly against the counter. "Okay." No hesitation, no visible concern, just readiness. Nate nodded once, like he had rehearsed this. "I've been thinking for a while," he began, "and I don't think this is working anymore." The words landed clearly, not sharp, not emotional, just final. Jenica didn't interrupt, didn't react immediately. She just looked at him, waiting. "I think we've grown in different directions," he continued, "and at this point, it doesn't make sense to keep forcing something that's not aligned." Aligned, another one of those words he had picked up. Jenica let out a slow breath. "How long you been thinking this?" she asked. Nate hesitated, just slightly. "A while." She nodded. "I figured." That caught him off guard. "You did?" he asked. Jenica gave a small shrug. "You don't talk to me anymore, Nate," she said. "You talk around me." He shifted his weight, like the statement didn't sit right, but not enough to challenge it. "That's not what this is about," he said. She didn't argue, because she knew. It was exactly what it was about. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice steady. "I think we should separate," Nate said, "and move forward with a divorce." There it was. Clear, direct, uncomplicated. Jenica looked at him for a long moment, not searching for something, not hoping he'd take it back, just seeing him clearly. 8 years, condensed into one conversation. "Okay," she said. The word hung in the air, and this time it landed differently. Nate blinked. "Okay?" he repeated. She nodded once. "If that's what you want." There was no anger in her voice, no pleading, no negotiation, and somehow that unsettled him more than anything else could have. "I just think it's the right decision," he added quickly, like he needed to reinforce it. Jenica didn't respond, because she wasn't questioning the decision. She was accepting the reality of it. Over the next few weeks, everything moved quickly. Nate handled the process like he handled everything else now. Efficient, organized, detached. Papers were filed, details were discussed, assets were divided. There were conversations, but none of them felt like closure. They felt like transactions. "We can keep this simple," Nate said at one point, sliding documents across the table. Jenica glanced down at them, then back up. "Simple for who?" she asked. He paused, then didn't answer. She signed what needed to be signed, asked questions when necessary, but she didn't fight, not because she didn't care, but because she understood something he didn't. You can't fight for a relationship that one person already walked away from. One afternoon, as they sat across from each other finalizing the last of the paperwork, Nate leaned back slightly. "This is better for both of us," he said. Jenica studied him. "You really believe that?" "I do," he replied. No hesitation, no doubt. She nodded slowly. "Okay," that word again, but this time, it wasn't acceptance of him. It was acceptance of the truth. The day everything was finalized, they stood in the same room, but it didn't feel like they were in the same place. Nate looked relieved, not emotionally, but structurally, like something had been cleared off his path. Jenica held the papers in her hand for a moment longer than necessary, not because she didn't understand what they meant, but because she understood exactly what they meant. This wasn't just an ending. It was a revelation. "You'll be fine," Nate said, almost casually. Jenica looked at him. There was a time when those words would have meant comfort. Now, they felt like distance. "I know," she said, and she meant it. That was the part Nate didn't expect. Not her calm, not her silence, but her certainty. Because in his version of the story, this was him moving forward. But in hers, this was her being released from something that had already let her go. As they walked out separately, the space between them didn't feel heavy. It felt clear. Jenica made a decision without announcing it, without explaining it, without needing anyone else to understand it. She chose not to fight for someone who had already decided she wasn't worth standing beside. And in that choice, she didn't lose anything. She regained something she didn't even realize had been slipping away. Herself. The night didn't feel important when it started. That was the strange part. No build-up that suggested everything was about to shift in a way neither of them could undo. Just two completely different moments happening at the same time. At Nate's house, the music was already playing before most people even arrived. Not loud enough to interrupt conversation, but loud enough to keep the energy up. The kind of music that made everything feel like a celebration, even if nobody said exactly what they were celebrating. Nate stood near the center of the room, drink in hand, moving easily between conversations like he had done it 100 times before. "Man, it was time," someone said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've been needing this." Nate smirked slightly. "Yeah, I think so too." There was no hesitation in his voice, no second guessing, just certainty. People filled the house quickly. Friends, colleagues, a few family members, all of them carrying the same energy. Light, congratulatory, almost relieved. Like they had been waiting for him to finally make this decision. "To new beginnings," someone said from across the room, raising their glass. A few others echoed it. "To new beginnings." Nate lifted his glass too. "To freedom," he added. The word hung in the air for just a second longer than the others. Then it dissolved into laughter. At some point, Jenica's name came up. Not heavily, not emotionally, just casually. 8 years, though, someone said. "That's a long time." Nate shrugged, taking a small sip of his drink. "Yeah," he said, "but time don't mean it's right." A few people nodded. One person laughed lightly. "You upgraded everything else, man. It was only a matter of time." Nate didn't respond to that. He just smiled, and that was it. No defense, no reflection, no acknowledgement of what those 8 years actually held. Across town, Jenica sat in her car, engine off, windows slightly fogged from the difference in temperature. Her keys still rested in her lap, untouched. She had just pulled up to her apartment, but hadn't moved since. Not because she didn't want to go inside, but because something about the moment had stopped her. Her phone sat in her hand, the screen still lit, the call still connected. "We just need to confirm a few final details on your end," the voice on the other side was saying. Professional, measured, normal. Jenica blinked slowly, trying to stay present in the conversation. "Yes," she said quietly. "I understand." Her voice didn't match what was happening, because inside, everything had gone still. "And once that's finalized, we'll move forward with the contract at the agreed amount." She swallowed slightly. "Okay." The voice continued, explaining next steps, timelines, expectations. But Jenica wasn't fully hearing it anymore, because one phrase had already landed, and it hadn't moved since. $50 million. Not loud, not overwhelming, just sitting there. Her fingers tightened slightly around the phone, not out of excitement, but out of focus, because the moment didn't feel the way she thought it would. There was no rush, no sudden burst of emotion, no immediate sense of victory, just clarity, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. It just exists. Back at Nate's house, the energy had only grown louder, music up, voices overlapping, people moving freely between rooms like the space belonged to them. Nate stood near the kitchen now, mid-conversation, laughing at something someone had just said. He looked relaxed, light, unburdened, like he had just removed something that was holding him back. Across town, Jenica finally ended the call. Her phone lowered slowly into her lap. The silence inside the car felt different now, not heavy, not empty, just full. She leaned her head back slightly, staring forward through the windshield, and for a long moment, she didn't move, because she understood something in that silence. Two things had just happened at the same time. One person was celebrating the end of something, and the other had just stepped into something entirely new, but only one of them understood the full weight of what that meant. Jenica exhaled slowly, her hand still resting lightly on her phone, not smiling, not crying, just sitting in the truth of the moment. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. She felt steady. Back at the house, Nate raised his glass again as someone called for another toast, and without hesitation, he smiled, not realizing that the story he thought he had closed was about to open in a way he never saw coming. Jenica didn't start the car right away. She just sat there, the phone still warm in her hand, her thumb resting near the screen like she might need to call them back and confirm it was real. But she didn't, because she knew it was. The voice from the call replayed in her mind. Not every word, just the part that mattered. We'd like to move forward. Contract. Value. 50 million. It wasn't the number that held her. It was everything behind it. All the nights she stayed up working quietly while Nate was out or asleep. All the times she told herself to keep going, even when nobody else knew what she was building. All the moments she chose not to explain her ideas because she already knew how they might be received. She thought back to one particular night, sitting at the same kitchen table, laptop open, scrolling through a section she couldn't quite get right. Nate had walked past her without stopping. "What you working on?" he had asked, barely looking. "Just something for work," she said. He nodded once, didn't ask anything else. At the time, it stung, not because she needed his approval, but because she remembered when he used to care enough to ask more. Now, sitting in her car, she realized something that felt both simple and heavy at the same time. She had been building something real, in a space where she wasn't being seen, and somehow, that hadn't stopped her. Jenica leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the steering wheel. Her eyes lowered for a moment, not closing, just settling. There was no urge to call anyone, no need to post anything, no excitement that needed to be shared immediately, because this moment didn't feel like something to announce. It felt like something to understand. 50 million. The number didn't define her. It revealed her. It showed her what she had been capable of all along, without validation, without attention, without someone else believing in her out loud. And that realization hit deeper than the contract itself. She let out a slow breath, then another. For the first time in a long time, her thoughts weren't tangled around Nate, not around what he said, not around what he thought, not around what he saw when he looked at her. That part felt distant, almost irrelevant, because in this moment, she wasn't measuring herself through him anymore. She sat back in her seat, her shoulders relaxing slightly. There was a time when she would have imagined sharing this moment with him, calling him first, hearing his reaction, feeling like it was something they accomplished together. But that version of them didn't exist anymore. And, surprisingly, that didn't hurt the way she expected it to. It just made sense. She looked down at her phone again, the screen now dim. Everything she had been quietly building was now real, documented, recognized, and the most important part, it had nothing to do with him. That realization didn't come with anger. It didn't come with bitterness. It came with clarity. She straightened slightly in her seat, not dramatically, just enough to feel grounded, because something had shifted, not in her circumstances, but in how she saw herself. She wasn't the version of herself that had been standing in that kitchen, questioning her worth. She wasn't the woman trying to keep up with a standard she never agreed to. She was someone who had built something valuable, quietly, consistently, on her own terms, and for the first time, she saw it clearly, without anyone else's voice shaping it. Outside, the street stayed quiet. A car passed in the distance. A light flickered on in one of the nearby apartments. Normal life, unchanged. But inside that car, something had settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, just permanently. Jenica picked up her phone again, glanced at it briefly, then set it down beside her. No rush, no urgency, just understanding. And in that understanding, she realized something she hadn't fully accepted before. She never needed Nate to become who she was becoming. Not his approval, not his validation, not his version of success. None of it. Everything she needed, she had already been building. He just never stayed long enough to see it. Jenica finally reached for her keys, paused, then looked forward again, and for the first time that night, a small, quiet expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but something close, because this moment wasn't about proving anything. It was about knowing. For the first time, Jenica saw her own value clearly, without needing it to be reflected back through anyone else. And once she saw it, there was no going back. Nate didn't notice anything had changed. At first, the music was still playing, people were still laughing, conversations were still overlapping in that same confident rhythm that had filled the house all night. From the outside, nothing had shifted, but it started small. A phone buzzed, then another, then another. At first, it blended into the noise. People checking messages, scrolling, half paying attention. But then one of Nate's friends looked down at his phone, frowned slightly, then looked back up. "Hold on," he said. "You seen this?" Nate glanced over. Seen what? The friend didn't answer right away. He was reading something again, like he needed to be sure before saying it out loud. Then he looked up. "Jenica," he said. The name landed differently this time. Not casual, not dismissive. "What about her?" Nate asked, his tone still relaxed, but just slightly tighter than before. The friend turned his phone toward him. "Man, is this real?" Nate took a step closer, his brow pulling together. "What am I looking at?" Apparently she just landed some major contract. Someone else chimed in from across the room, already checking their own phone. Like, big. How big? Nate asked. There was a pause. Then, 50 million. The room didn't go silent, but something in the energy shifted, subtly, noticeably. Nate stared at the screen for a second longer than he needed to, then again, like the number might change if he looked at it twice. "Where you hearing that from?" he asked. "Multiple places," the friend replied. "It's circulating already." Another voice cut in. "Yeah, I just got the same thing. That's not small. That's real money." Nate's grip on his glass tightened slightly. Not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough. For a moment, he didn't say anything, didn't react the way people expected him to, because his mind was trying to catch up. Jenica, the same Jenica they had been talking about earlier like she was already behind him, the same Jenica he had just let go. "That don't make sense," he said, almost under his breath. But it did. He just hadn't been paying attention. Across the room, conversations started shifting. People who had been laughing minutes ago were now speaking in lower tones, more focused, more interested. "That's a big move. She must have been working on that for a while. You didn't know about this?" Someone asked Nate directly. That question landed heavier than all the others. Nate looked up, paused, then shook his head once. No. Another silence. Not loud, but present. And, in that moment, something uncomfortable settled into the room, because it wasn't just about the contract anymore. It was about what it meant that he didn't know. Nate set his glass down slowly. "Where is she?" he asked. No one answered right away, because no one actually knew. One of his friends stepped closer. "You should call her," he said. Nate didn't move. "Yeah," someone else added. "You need to talk to her." Another voice. "Man, you might want to fix that." Fix that. The same people who had been supporting him earlier, encouraging him to move on, were now looking at the situation differently, not because of who Jenica was, but because of what she had just become in their eyes. Nate felt it, that shift, clearer than anything else that night, and for the first time, he didn't feel in control of the room anymore. He reached for his phone, paused, then unlocked it. Her name was still there. Nothing had changed on the screen, but everything had changed behind it. He hesitated for just a second, then hit call. It rang, once, twice, no answer. He pulled the phone away slightly, staring at it, then tried again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. Across town, Jenica was already out of her car. walking up the stairs to her apartment slowly, her step steady, her phone silent in her hand. Back at the house, Nate looked up. They saying she just left somewhere. Someone offered, checking their phone again. Might be heading home. That was all he needed. I'm going, Nate said quickly, grabbing his keys. A few people exchanged looks. Then one of them nodded. Yeah, we should go. Within minutes, the energy of the party completely changed. Music still playing, but no one listening. Drinks left half full. Conversations abandoned mid-sentence. People who had come to celebrate were now moving with urgency. Let's go talk to her. You don't want to lose that. Man, you gotta fix this tonight. That, not her. And whether Nate fully realized it or not, that word carried everything. Because now, suddenly, Jenica wasn't the woman he had outgrown. She was an opportunity, and everyone around him reacted accordingly. Nate moved quickly toward the door, his mind racing in a way it hadn't all night. Because for the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he had gained. He was thinking about what he had just lost. And for the first time, that realization didn't feel clean. It felt heavy, uncertain, real. Across town, Jenica reached the top of the stairs, paused, then stepped toward her door. Behind her, footsteps approached. Fast. Jenica. She stopped and slowly turned around. The night hadn't finished revealing everything yet. Jenica already knew who it was before she fully turned around. There was something about the urgency in the footsteps, the way her name was called, not casually, not like before, but like it suddenly mattered again. Jenica. She faced them slowly. Nate stood a few steps below her on the staircase, slightly out of breath. Behind him, a few familiar faces, his friends, his family, hovered in the background, trying to look less involved than they actually were. The same people who had agreed with him, the same people who had watched everything unfold without ever questioning it. Now they were here, together. Jenica didn't speak right away. She just looked at Nate, really looked at him. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to read him. She was just seeing him clearly. Nate stepped forward, his voice softer than it had been in months. Can we talk? Jenica tilted her head slightly. We already did, she said. Her tone wasn't harsh, just honest. This is different, he replied quickly. A pause. She considered that for a second, then nodded once. Okay, she said. Talk. He hesitated. That confidence he carried earlier that night, it wasn't there anymore. I didn't know, he said. Jenica blinked. Didn't know what? About what you've been working on, he said. The contract. All of it. She held his gaze. That's because you stopped asking a long time ago. The words landed without force, but they didn't need it. One of his friends stepped in slightly, like the silence made him uncomfortable. Jenica. Look. We all think maybe things just move too fast, he said. 8 years is a lot to just end like that. Jenica turned her eyes toward him briefly, then back to Nate. So now it's too fast? She asked. No one answered. Another voice followed. You know, sometimes people just need to take a step back and think things through. Jenica let out a small breath. Not frustration, not anger, just recognition, because she could hear it clearly now. The shift. Not concern, not care, calculation. Nate stepped closer again. We can fix this, he said. We've been through too much to just throw it away. Jenica studied him carefully. We didn't just throw it away, Nate, she said. You made a decision. I made a mistake, he corrected quickly. That word hung there. Mistake. Behind him, someone added, Yeah, man. Everybody makes mistakes. Jenica's eyes moved past Nate for just a second, taking in the people standing behind him, then back to him again. And that's when she said it, quietly, but clearly. You're not here because of me. Nate frowned slightly. What do you mean? She held his gaze. You're here because of that. That, the word sat between them. Heavy, unavoidable. No one needed her to explain it. The contract, the number, the opportunity, everything that had suddenly made her visible again. Nate shook his head quickly. That's not fair, he said. I came because... Because what? She asked. He stopped, just for a second, and in that second, everything she needed to see was there. Not love, not regret, just realization. And behind him, agreement. You don't want to lose that, one of his friends had said earlier. She heard it again now, clearer, louder. Jenica nodded slowly. Exactly, she said, because the truth didn't need to be argued. It just needed to be recognized. And now it had been. Jenica didn't raise her voice. She didn't step forward. She didn't match their urgency with emotion. She just stood there, calm, grounded, certain. 8 years, she said softly. The words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but they reached everyone. I stood by you when you didn't have anything, she continued. Not because I had to, because I believed in you. Nate nodded quickly. I know that, and I appreciate. You didn't appreciate it, she said, cutting him off, not harshly, just directly. Silence. You erased it, she added. That landed differently, because it wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what he had rewritten. Jenica took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to continue. You let people talk about me like I didn't matter, she said. You joked about me. You agreed with them. Nate's expression tightened. That's not what I meant. It doesn't matter what you meant, she said. It matters what you allowed. Another pause. And the worst part? She continued. You didn't even notice when I started disappearing. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else, because it was true. She hadn't left loudly. She hadn't argued endlessly. She hadn't demanded to be seen. She had just faded from his attention, and he hadn't noticed. Jenica looked at him one last time, not searching, not hoping, just confirming. This contract, she said, lifting her phone slightly. It didn't change me. A pause. It revealed me. Nate swallowed, but didn't speak. Everything I built, she continued, I did while you were already moving away from me. Her voice didn't shake, because she wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was just telling the truth. And now, she said, her tone softening slightly, but not emotionally, just clearly. Now you see me because there's something attached to it. She didn't say the number again. She didn't have to. They all knew. Jenica took a small step back, not retreating, just creating space. I needed you to see me when there was nothing to gain, she said. A pause. You didn't. That was it. No anger, no blame, just clarity. And then, the decision. I'm not going backwards, she said. No hesitation, no second guessing, just finality. Jenica chose herself, not loudly, not emotionally, but completely. For a moment, no one moved. Not Nate, not the people behind him, because there wasn't anything left to say that would change what had just been decided. Nate looked at her like he wanted to respond, like he was trying to find the right words, but there weren't any, because this wasn't a conversation that needed more explanation. It needed acceptance, and he wasn't ready for that. You're really just going to walk away? He asked finally. Jenica didn't react to the question the way he expected. She didn't take it as an accusation. She took it as a realization. I'm not walking away, she said. A small pause. You already did. That was the difference. She wasn't leaving something that was whole. She was acknowledging something that had already ended. Nate's shoulders dropped slightly, not dramatically, just enough to show the weight of it. Behind him, the people who had followed him there stood quieter now, less certain, less involved, because the energy had changed again. And this time, there was nothing to gain from staying in it. Jenica turned toward her door, her hand resting lightly on the handle. She paused for just a second, not to reconsider, just to breathe. Then she opened it, no hesitation, no looking back, and stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her. Outside, the night felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because something had been settled. Nate stood there for a moment longer, then another, waiting for something that wasn't coming. No second chance, no emotional breakdown, no reversal, just consequence. And for the first time, he had to sit in it, not as punishment, but as reality. Inside her apartment, Jenica leaned back against the door for a brief moment. Her eyes closed, not from exhaustion, but from release. She let out a slow breath, not because everything was suddenly easy, but because everything was finally clear. Love had taught her patience. But clarity had taught her something more important, that not everyone who walks with you deserves to stay. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stop trying to be seen by someone who chose not to look. Jenica pushed herself gently away from the door, walked further into her space, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like hers, not shared, not questioned, just hers. And in that quiet, there was something stronger than closure. There was alignment, not loud, not dramatic, but real, and that was enough. The story didn't end that night. Not really, because real endings rarely feel like endings when you're living them. They feel like quiet beginnings you don't fully understand yet. The next morning, Jenica woke up before her alarm, not because she had to, just because her body hadn't caught up with everything that had shifted. For a moment, she lay there, staring at the ceiling. The room was still unfamiliar in a way, new, smaller than the house she had left, but somehow more honest. No extra space to impress anyone, no rooms filled just to look complete, just what she needed. She sat up slowly, her feet touching the floor, grounding herself in something simple, routine. That was always where she found herself again. The coffee machine hummed softly in the kitchen as she moved through the motions. Pour, stir, sip, same actions, different meaning. Her phone sat on the counter, silent, no missed calls she needed to return, no messages she felt obligated to respond to. For the first time in a long time, there was no emotional noise attached to it. She glanced at it once, then left it there, because not everything needed immediate attention anymore. Later that day, she sat at her table, laptop open again, the same document in front of her. But this time, it wasn't something she was building quietly in the background of her life. It was the center of it. She adjusted a few things, reviewed details, moved forward, not with urgency, but with intention. And as she worked, something became clearer with every passing minute. She hadn't just survived what happened. She had stepped out of something that no longer aligned with who she was becoming. Across town, Nate's house felt different too, but not in the same way. The silence there didn't feel peaceful. It felt exposed. The same rooms, the same furniture, the same space he had once filled with people, music, and noise. Now it just echoed. He walked through it slowly that morning, not really looking for anything, just moving. His phone buzzed a few times. Messages, conversations continuing from the night before. Did you talk to her? You good? Man, that situation crazy. He read them, didn't respond, because none of those conversations addressed what actually mattered. They weren't about Jenica, they were about what she had become. And for the first time, Nate saw that clearly, not because someone explained it to him, but because of how quickly everything shifted, how fast people changed their tone, their advice, their concern. He sat down on the couch, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, and for a moment, he thought about something he hadn't let himself sit with before. Not the contract, not the money, but the years, the small apartment, the late nights, the way Jenica used to sit beside him when he didn't have answers, the way she never made him feel behind, and the way he had made her feel exactly that. That realization didn't come with noise. It came quietly, the same way everything real tends to. He leaned back, staring at nothing in particular, because for the first time, he wasn't looking forward. He was looking back, and realizing what he missed wasn't something he could call back. It was something he had already let go. Weeks passed. Jenica's life didn't suddenly become perfect. That wasn't the point. There were still long days, still moments of doubt, still times where she sat quietly, thinking about everything that had happened. But those moments didn't pull her backward anymore. They grounded her, reminded her of what she had learned, of what she would never accept again. Her work grew, not overnight, not in a way that needed attention, but steadily, the same way she had always done everything. People started reaching out, new conversations, new opportunities, but this time, she approached everything differently. She didn't rush to prove herself, didn't overextend, didn't shrink to fit anyone else's expectations. She chose carefully, because now, she understood her value before anyone else confirmed it, and that changed everything. One evening, As the sun set through her apartment window, Jenica sat quietly, her phone resting beside her. She wasn't waiting for anything, not a call, not an apology, not closure, because she already had it, not from Nate, from herself, and that was the part most people don't realize. Closure doesn't always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes, it comes from finally seeing things clearly enough to stop needing anything from them at all. Jenica leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, not heavy, not tired, just settled. And somewhere in that quiet, a truth stayed with her. The right people don't suddenly recognize your worth when the world does. They recognize it when there's nothing to gain. And if they can't, then losing them isn't a setback. It's clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the most valuable thing you'll ever walk away with. If this story hit you in any way, take a second and really sit with it. Have you ever stayed in something longer than you should have, hoping someone would finally see your worth? Or maybe you've been on the other side, realizing a little too late what you had. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and your story might help someone else more than you know. And if you believe that self-respect should always come before ego, go ahead and like this video so more people can hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe and become part of the Mr. Graham family, because here, we don't just tell stories. We learn from them,